Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How can an AWS partner company securely access resources in a customer account from a different organization?
The most secure way is for the customer to create an IAM role with the necessary permissions. The partner company can then use the IAM role's Amazon resource name, including the external ID in the IAM role's trust policy, to request access.
What solution would you recommend for migrating a third-party route planning application to AWS while minimizing operational overhead?
I would recommend creating an Amazon Elastic Container Service cluster on AWS Fargate. Then I would use the AWS CLI run task command with enable ECS managed tags set to true to launch the application and assign a custom tag to the task.
What could cause a peering failure when trying to connect an application VPC in US East 1 with a shared services VPC in US East 2?
The error could be due to overlapping IPv4 CIDR ranges between the two VPCs, and also because the IAM role in the peer acceptor account may not have the correct permissions.
How can a company ensure that its AWS Lambda functions have only the minimum permissions needed for their tasks?
The company should turn on AWS CloudTrail logging for their account and use AWS Identity and Access Management Access Analyzer to generate IAM access policies based on the recorded activity. Then, they should review these generated policies to ensure compliance with business requirements.
How would you analyze and optimize the resource usage of Amazon EC2 instances and EBS volumes in a cost-effective manner?
I would install the Amazon CloudWatch agent on each EC2 instance and enable AWS Compute Optimizer. After allowing it to run for at least 12 hours, I would review its recommendations and right-size the EC2 instances accordingly.
How would you provide database administrators access to secrets stored in AWS Secrets Manager without manual sharing?
I would use AWS Resource Access Manager to share the secrets from the application account with the DBA account. Then, I would create an IAM role named DBA Admin in the DBA account and grant it the necessary permissions to access the shared secrets. Finally, I would attach the DBA admin role to the EC2 instance for accessing the cross-account secrets.
How would you ensure that all resources in an AWS organization are deployed only in the AP Northeast 1 region, and that specific EC2 instance types are used in the DataOps organizational unit?
I would create a service control policy using the AWS requested region condition, key to restrict access to all AWS regions except AP Northeast 1, and apply it to the root organizational unit. Additionally, I would create another service control policy using the EC2 instance type condition key to restrict access to specific instance types and apply that to the DataOps organizational unit.
How can a company process URLs in multiple AWS regions while publishing from a single region?
The company should deploy the SQS queue along with the Lambda function to other regions and subscribe the SQS queue in each region to the existing SNS topic.
What strategy would you recommend for revising the architecture of a proprietary stateless ETL application running on Amazon EC2?
I would recommend using AWS Fargate to run the application and invoke the Fargate task every 4 hours with Amazon Event Bridge.
How would you design a multi-region solution for a sequel to a popular online game to reduce latency and improve reliability?
I would create another S3 bucket in a new region and configure S3 cross-region replication between the buckets. Then, I would create an Amazon CloudFront distribution with origin failover to access the S3 buckets in each region. Finally, I would configure DynamoDB global tables by enabling Amazon DynamoDB streams and add a replica table in the new region.
How would you migrate a Java backend application with a MongoDB database to AWS while ensuring high availability?
I would configure Amazon Document DB with MongoDB compatibility in on-demand capacity mode across multiple availability zones for the database, and deploy EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones for the Java backend.
How can users from the strategy account access an S3 bucket in the creative account with minimum permissions?
First, I would update the Strategy Reviewer IAM role to grant full permissions for the S3 bucket and decrypt permissions for the custom KMS key. Then, I would update the KMS key policy in the Creative account to grant decrypt permissions to the Strategy Reviewer role. Finally, I would ensure the IAM role has read permissions for the S3 bucket and decrypt permissions for the KMS key.
What solution would you recommend for a life sciences company looking to re-architect their genomics analysis platform on AWS?
I would recommend using AWS Data Sync to transfer the sequencing data to Amazon S3. Then, use S3 events to trigger an AWS Lambda function that starts an AWS Step Functions workflow. Additionally, store the Docker images in Amazon Elastic Container Registry and trigger AWS Batch to run the containers for processing the sequencing data.
How would you design a highly available and fault-tolerant solution for a content management application that requires Active Directory integration and consistent content across instances?
I would create a new Amazon machine image from the current EC2 instance, set up an Amazon FSx for Lustre file system, and then create an auto-scaling group spanning 3 availability zones with a minimum of 3 instances. A user data script would be used to join the instances to the Active Directory domain and mount the FSx for Lustre file system.
How would you migrate a case management solution's email functionality to AWS while minimizing operational overhead?
I would set up Amazon Simple Email Service to send the email messages. The email template would be stored in an Amazon S3 bucket. Then, I would create an AWS Lambda function to retrieve the template from S3, merge the customer data with it, and use an SDK in the Lambda function to send the email.
What could the company do to resolve the issue of messages ending up in the dead letter queue for unprocessed videos?
They could update the redrive policy and set the max receive count to 0.
How would you design a solution to make a set of APIs accessible only from a VPC while ensuring they are called by authenticated users?
I would deploy the Lambda functions inside the VPC, provision an EC2 instance, and install an Apache server. From the Apache server, I would call the Lambda functions and use the internal kname record of the EC2 instance to access the API.
How would you resolve performance issues for a weather services web application that serves users in the US East 1 region?
I would create a new S3 bucket in OS East 1 and set up S3 cross-region replication to synchronize with the bucket in EU West 1. Additionally, I would use Lambda to modify requests from North America to utilize the new S3 bucket in US East 1.
How would you address the issue of a company unable to establish new sessions in Amazon workspaces due to user profile storage reaching its maximum capacity?
I would monitor the file system using the free storage capacity metric in Amazon CloudWatch and use AWS step functions to increase the capacity as needed.
What solution would you propose to improve the delivery management system that is currently facing issues with dropped connections and memory problems?
I would use AWS Transfer Family to create an FTP server that places the files in Amazon Elastic File System. Then, I would mount the EFS volume to the existing EC2 instance and point it to the new path for file processing.
How would you ensure that an application running on Amazon ECS can recover to a separate AWS region without data loss?
I would provision an Aurora replica in a different region to meet the regulatory requirements.
How would you handle the automatic masking of sensitive credit card data and transform it into JSON format for processing in AWS?
I would create an AWS glue crawler and a custom classifier based on the data feed formats to build a table definition. Then, I would invoke an AWS Lambda function on file delivery to start an AWS Glue ETL job that transforms the records according to the requirements and outputs the results in JSON format.
What solution would you recommend for creating a business continuity solution on AWS for an application that uses a MySQL database?
I would recommend creating AWS Database Migration Service replication servers and a target Amazon Aurora MySQL DB cluster to host the database. We would set up a DMS replication task to copy the existing data and use the AWS Schema Conversion tool for change data capture to keep the data synchronized. The rest of the software can be installed on EC2 instances, starting with a compatible base AMI.
How would you provide external auditors with secure read-only access to a company's AWS account while complying with security best practices?
I would create an IAM role in the company's AWS account that trusts the auditor's AWS account. Then, I'd create an IAM policy with the necessary permissions and attach it to the role, ensuring to assign a unique external ID to the role's trust policy.
What solution would you recommend to improve the performance of a latency-sensitive trading platform using Amazon DynamoDB?
I would create a 2-node DynamoDB accelerator cluster and configure the application to read and write data using DAX.
How would you optimize the infrastructure cost for an application running on AWS that experiences peak usage, mainly during lunchtime?
I would move the application front-end to a static website hosted on Amazon S3 and deploy the back-end Python application to general-purpose burstable EC2 instances that have the same number of cores as the existing instances.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for an event ticketing platform on AWS that experiences infrequent high peaks in demand?
I would recommend purchasing compute savings plans for the predicted medium load of the EKS cluster. Then, I would scale the cluster with on-demand capacity reservations based on event dates for peak demand. Additionally, I would suggest purchasing one-year no upfront reserved instances for the database to handle the predicted base load and temporarily scaling out database read replicas during peak times.
How would you handle routine maintenance for an application deployed on AWS Elastic Beanstalk while ensuring visitors receive an informational message?
First, I would upload static informational content to an Amazon S3 bucket. Then, I would set that S3 bucket as a second origin in the original CloudFront distribution and configure it with an origin access identity. Finally, during the maintenance, I would edit the default cache behavior to use the S3 origin and revert it back once the maintenance is complete.
How would you simplify the image processing parameter updates for a Lambda function to minimize disruptions for users?
I would create a Lambda function alias and modify the client application to use the alias ARN. This way, I can reconfigure the alias to point to new function versions after testing.
How would you ensure a global media application is consistently available across 2 continents with minimal effort?
I would create an AWS Global Accelerator with multiple endpoint groups targeting the appropriate AWS regions and use its static IP address for the Apex domain in public DNS.
How would you simplify the deployment of a serverless API using Amazon API Gateway and AWS Lambda while optimizing for code reuse?
I would deploy the shared libraries and custom classes to a Docker image, upload it to Amazon Elastic Container Registry, create a Lambda layer from that image, and then deploy the API's Lambda functions as zip packages configured to use the Lambda layer.
How would you deploy a machine learning model for defect detection in a manufacturing environment with local feedback requirements?
I would deploy Amazon Monitron devices on each IP camera and an Amazon Monitron gateway on premises. The ML model would be deployed to the Monitron devices, and I would use health state alarms to call the local API when a defect is detected.
How would you create a business case for migrating a company's on-premises data center to AWS using a configuration management database export?
I would use AWS Application Discovery Service to import the CMDB data and perform an analysis.
How would you mitigate application layer attacks on a website running on Amazon EC2 with an application load balancer?
I would create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm to monitor user IP addresses and set a threshold based on access. Then, I'd configure the alarm to invoke an AWS Lambda function that adds a deny rule in the application's subnet route table for any IP addresses that trigger the alarm.
How would you ensure that the data tier of a critical application is compliant with company policy by deploying it across 2 AWS regions?
I would add another region to each table in the Aurora MySQL DB cluster and convert the existing DynamoDB table to a global table by adding another region to its configuration.
How would you allow traffic flow to an AWS application from an on-premises network using a firewall appliance with an allow list based on IP addresses?
I would configure the existing application load balancer to use static IP addresses, assign IP addresses in multiple availability zones, and then add those IP addresses to the firewall appliance.
How can a company prevent internet traffic from directly accessing its application load balancer while minimizing operational overhead?
The best approach is to add a security group rule to the ALB that allows traffic only from the various CloudFront IP address ranges.
How would you secure an Amazon Elasticache for Redis cluster that currently lacks user authentication and encryption in transit?
I would create an SSL certificate and store it in AWS Secrets Manager. Then I would create a new cluster with encryption in transit configured and update the application to retrieve the SSL certificate from Secrets Manager for authentication.
How can a company improve the reliability of a workload running on Amazon EC2 spot instances in an auto-scaling group?
The solution is to update the launch template for the auto-scaling group to increase the number of placement groups.
How would you migrate a document processing workload to AWS while ensuring local access to files and public availability within 30 minutes?
I would configure Amazon FSx for Lustre with an import and export policy, link it to an S3 bucket, and mount the document store on an Amazon EC2 instance using NFS.
How can a delivery company ensure that when a user is deleted, all microservices delete their copies of the user data immediately?
The company can configure the central user service to post a message on an Amazon Simple Queue service queue when a user is deleted. Each microservice would then create an event filter on the SQS queue to delete the user from its own storage.
How can a company provide IP addresses to external customers connecting to a web application running behind an application load balancer?
The company can allocate an elastic IP address and assign it to the application load balancer. Then they can provide that elastic IP address to the customer.
What steps would you take to enforce Amazon Elastic Block Store encryption at rest for production accounts in AWS?
I would create a new AWS Control Tower landing zone in the company's management account, then add production and development accounts to the respective organizational units. Additionally, I would create a guardrail from the management account to detect EBS encryption.
How would you improve the resiliency of a critical stateful web application running on Amazon EC2 instances with an RDS for MySQL database?
I would configure the EC2 instances to use Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager to take snapshots of the EBS volumes. I would also set up RDS automated backups and configure backup replication to a second AWS region. Additionally, I would create an application load balancer in that second region and use an AWS Global Accelerator endpoint for optimal latency.
How can a solutions architect optimize and appropriately size Amazon EC2 instances based on CPU, memory, and network metrics?
They should turn on AWS Trusted Advisor and review the recommendations for low utilization instances and configure AWS Compute Optimizer to receive findings and optimization recommendations.
How would you create a backup of an AWS code commit repository in a second AWS region?
I would set up an Amazon Event Bridge rule to trigger AWS code build whenever code is pushed to the repository. Code build would then clone the repository, zip the content, and copy it to an S3 bucket in the second region.
How can a marketing application be made accessible to multiple business units with overlapping CIDR ranges on AWS?
The best solution is to create a network load balancer in front of the marketing application in a private subnet. Then I would set up an API gateway API and use the private integration feature to connect the API to the load balancer. Activating IAM authorization for the API would allow me to grant access to the other business units' accounts.
How would you set up notifications for when an Amazon S3 bucket becomes publicly exposed in a newly acquired AWS account?
I would create an S3 event notification on all S3 buckets for the IS public event and select the SNS topic as the target for the event notifications.
How would you assess a newly acquired company's applications and databases for migration to AWS?
I would use AWS Application Migration Service to run agents on the on-premises infrastructure and manage them with AWS Migration Hub. Additionally, I would use AWS Storage Gateway to evaluate local storage needs and database dependencies.
What solution would you recommend for an application running as a replica set in an Amazon EKS cluster that needs to back up many small files for a year?
I would recommend creating an Amazon Elastic file system and a mount target for each subnet in the EKS cluster. Then I would configure the replica set to mount this file system and direct the application to store files there. Finally, I would set up AWS Backup to retain copies of the data for 1 year.
How would you migrate a customer service center to AWS to improve reliability with minimal operational overhead?
I would use Amazon Connect to replace the old call center hardware and Amazon Pinpoint to send text message surveys to customers.
What disaster recovery strategy would you recommend for a call center built using Amazon Connect to ensure the lowest recovery time objective?
I would recommend provisioning a new Amazon Connect instance in a second region with all existing users and contact flows. Additionally, I would set up an Amazon Route 53 health check for the instance URL and create a CloudWatch alarm for any failed health checks. An AWS Lambda function would be used to deploy a CloudFormation template for provisioning claimed phone numbers, and the alarm would trigger this function.
How would you create a data product using AWS Data Exchange to share data with customers while ensuring identity confirmation?
I would create an AWS Data Exchange data share by connecting it to the Redshift cluster in the AWS account of the company that produces the data. I would also configure subscription verification and require customers to subscribe to the data product.
How would you design a solution to process events that can scale based on the number of events received and handle processing errors?
I would publish events to an Amazon SQS and create an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group. The auto-scaling group would scale based on the approximate age of oldest message metric of the queue, and I would configure the application to write failed messages to a dead letter queue.
How would you handle unpredictable bursts of traffic for a RESTful API that processes environmental data in AWS?
I would create an Amazon API Gateway HTTP API for the RESTful API and integrate it with an Amazon Simple Queue service queue. Then I would set up an AWS Lambda function to process the messages from the SQS queue.
How would you enable communication between VPCs in the same organizational unit while preventing communication with VPCs in other units in AWS?
I would create a dedicated networking account in each organizational unit with a single VPC. Then I would establish a VPN connection between the networking account and the other accounts in the unit, using third-party routing software to manage transitive traffic.
What solution would you recommend for a company migrating an application to AWS that needs to store large documents securely?
I would recommend using Amazon S3 with a bucket policy to enforce HTTPS for connections and to ensure server-side encryption with AWS KMS for object encryption.
How would you prevent SQL injection attacks on a company's public API that runs on Amazon ECS?
I would create a new AWS WAF Web ACL and add a rule to block requests that match the SQL database rule group. This Web ACL would allow all other traffic and be attached to the application load balancer in front of the ECS tasks.
How would you ensure business continuity for an environmental company collecting air quality data with AWS IoT Core and storing it in DynamoDB across 2 AWS regions?
I would create a domain configuration for AWS IoT Core in each region, set up an Amazon Route 53 health check to evaluate the domain's health, and implement a failover routing policy. Additionally, I would update the DynamoDB table to a global table.
How would you provide the marketing team access to specific attributes of a DynamoDB table that contains confidential data?
I would create an IAM role in the finance team's account using IAM policy conditions for fine-grained access control. I would then establish trust with the marketing team's account, allowing them to create an IAM role that can assume the role in the finance team's account.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.